How many times have you asked yourself, a guildmate, or a friend, which great building is better? I know I have. So today, we're going to put an end to that question and figure out exactly which great buildings are best for nearly any situation, from attack boost to the antique stealer. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. We'll start with diamonds. Only a small handful of great buildings provide diamonds, but considering their rarity, it's understandable why you'd want to invest in the great buildings that can provide the most of these shiny blue rocks. You may be surprised to know that the Seed Vault actually takes the crown here easily, with over 20 diamonds per day at higher levels. Even aiding only 100 players per day, you generate more diamonds than the Blue Galaxy does doubling wishing wells. If we remove the Seed Vault though, we can see the rest of the great buildings a little bit easier. The Blue Galaxy does pretty well for itself, giving more diamonds per day than a wishing well at only level 3, with the Himeji Castle and Space Carrier not far behind at their 8th levels. I've also included the Crow's Nest here for comparison. Where things really start to get interesting is when we look at the diamonds per year from each great building. This green line is what the Guild Expeditions provides, and yes, you're seeing that right, the Seed Vault can provide more diamonds per year than the Expeditions, up to double it in fact. Unsurprisingly, the Seed Vault continues to dominate in diamonds per tile, being even more efficient than a little wishing well at a very low level. So if we remove it from the chart, we get a better picture of the other great buildings. The Blue Galaxy and Space Carrier are able to be more efficient than little wishing wells, though the Space Carrier barely squeaks by at its highest levels. The Himeji Castle is unable to, but it's still worth placing for its other bonuses in my opinion. Moving on to attack boost, we have only 4 great buildings: the Statue of Zeus, Cathedral of Aachen, Castel del Monte, and Terracotta Army. Together these form the most boring chart of this entire video. This shows the attack boost for each level for these great buildings, and the Zeus, COA, and CDM all share the same stat for this. However, even though the Terracotta Army has a lower amount of total attack boost at the same levels as the others, that doesn't mean it's a bad building for attack boost, it's just consistently more expensive than all the others. It falls behind in attack boost per tile, and this chart also shows the incredible efficiency of the Statue of Zeus due to it only taking up 6 tiles. Where things do get mildly interesting are in this chart, the cost of each additional % of attack boost. That's right, the Terracotta Army is much more expensive than its fellows, with the Zeus, COA, and CDM following, with the Zeus being the cheapest. In fact, you can see in this chart, which I removed the Terracotta Army from due to its high cost, leveling the Zeus to level 100 costs nearly 20,000 forge points less than the Castel del Monte. Again though, does this make the Terracotta Army bad? No. These are the only 4 buildings for attack boost, so I would recommend leveling them in the order of their ages, or Zeus, Cathedral of Aachen, Castel del Monte, and finally the Terracotta Army. Remember though, especially with Guild Expeditions level 5, the Terracotta Army can come in handy with its secondary bonus of defense boost. But what about those defense boosts? We've got even fewer great buildings here, being the Deal Castle, St. Basil's Cathedral, and the Terracotta Army again. As you might expect, the St. Basil's Cathedral and Deal Castle provide more attack boost than the Terracotta Army, but the TA pulls ahead of the DC when we look at defense per tile, due to the Deal Castle's massive 7x7 size. Additionally, since the SBC and DC are only 1 age apart, they are extremely close in the case of forge points per additional % of defense boost, and the Terracotta Army shows its much more expensive price here once again. While making this video, I made a bunch of graphs that aren't interesting enough for a full discussion, so here's the lightning round. First up is previous era goods. There's only one building that gives these, which is the Stargazer, making our graph just one curved line. As you can tell by the chart, it seems to top out at 150 previous age goods. Moving on, I told you these are quick, we have guild goods, which only come from the Observatory, Atomium, Arc, and AI Core. If you thought one curved line was boring, how about 4 completely straight ones? Basically, the higher the age of the great building, the more guild goods it'll produce. The only slight change up is that the Observatory will take the lead in guild goods per tile. Next up is Support Pool, the bonus that only gets used in guild versus guild, so very rarely. Only 3 buildings help out with this, being the Observatory, St. Basil's Cathedral, and Deal Castle, but the latter 2 provide the same bonus. This means that, somewhat unsurprisingly, the Observatory is your best bet for getting extra support pool for your guild. Last for the lightning round is Happiness. There's a surprising amount of buildings providing happiness, including the Oracle of Delphi, Colosseum, Hagia Sophia, Notre Dame, Frauenkirche of Dresden, Alcatraz, Space Needle, Atomium, Lotus Temple, and the Gia statue. Or, in other words, a list of everyone's least favorite great buildings except for the Traz and Atomium. It turns out that so few people level these that there isn't even proper data for their bonuses. But regardless, the Gia statue comes out on top in raw happiness, and even more so once we start looking at happiness per tile, where it just dominates. Now back to normal great building bonuses that more people care about. In terms of current age goods, there's quite a few great buildings that can help us here, including the Temple of Relics, Space Carrier, Himeji Castle, Flying Island, Seed Vault, and Blue Galaxy. Some of these, like the Temple of Relics and Seed Vault, depend on you completing more guild expedition encounters or aiding more players, so I've given a couple different options for each on the chart. In terms of goods, the Temple of Relics and Flying Island are a lot worse than the others, and the Himeji Castle and Space Carrier are surprisingly good, pun intended. The Blue Galaxy is as good as the buildings it boosts, so if you use the Blue Galaxy to boost buildings that provide 30 goods, which there are quite a few of, you can get over 300 goods per day from the Blue Galaxy. However, the Sea Vault comes out of nowhere and beats even the Blue Galaxy. That's right, the Sea Vault is pretty powerful in terms of not just diamonds, but also goods. The Sea Vault is best when you can aid more people, so to get the most value out of it, you have to increase your friends list and aid everyone daily, which is pretty easy via Aid All. Right now, I just know I've got some players writing comments that I'm forgetting a great building, and you're right. The Chateau Frontenac can boost goods rewards from your quests, and it's dominant in terms of goods per day, with up to 2,000 goods every single day from looping its recurring quests. This will cost you a pretty penny of coins and supplies though, as well as a lot of time needed to loop those quests. To put how many goods this is in perspective, that little blue line at the very bottom is the top line of the previous chart, of the Seed Vault with 300 aids per day. Our next bonus is Forge Points, which is a common reward across many buildings. We're talking the Hagia Sophia, Castel del Monte, Innovation Tower, Cape Canaveral, Arctic Orangery, Kraken, Temple of Relics, Blue Galaxy, Himeji Castle, Space Carrier, and Flying Island. With all these great buildings, the chart tends to get a little bit cluttered. However, the Blue Galaxy comes out on top, generating more than 150 Forge Points per day, if you use it to boost buildings that produce more than 15 Forge Points per day. And doing this is easier than you may think. While there are only a small handful of buildings providing this many Forge Points outside of chain sets, any building producing 13 or more Forge Points will provide over 15 if you also have the Forgotten Temple placed due to its Forge Point boost. The worst great buildings for Forge Points are the Temple of Relics and Flying Island, with the latter only approaching 30 Forge Points per day at its highest levels. Now, we could look at Forge Points per tile, but it gets really messy really fast. What we can see though is that the Cape Canaveral is the best, but it is closely followed by the Blue Galaxy. Interestingly, the Space Carrier is the next closest, which I would not have expected. This second chart is the same one but zoomed in on the first 50 levels. Here you can see when various great buildings are breaking the threshold of a Shrine of Knowledge, which is a quarter of a Forge Point per tile, and a level 2 Shrine of Knowledge, which is half of a Forge Point per tile. The Temple of Relics is once again the worst here, breaking the level of half a Forge Point per tile at only level 39. The Hagia Sophia is also pretty far down in terms of Forge Points per tile, mainly due to its massive size. We're still not done with Forge Points though, as one of the best ways to look at Forge Point producing great buildings is via return on investment or break-even points. Since great buildings cost Forge Points to level, but these produce Forge Points, we can compare how long it takes for each great building to pay back the amount of Forge Points needed to level it to a certain level, also known as its break-even point. It turns out that the Flying Island is horrendous, leveling out at about 1,300 days or about 3.5 years before skyrocketing. The Temple of Relics isn't much further behind. After we remove these two though, we get a much nicer chart. As you can see, most great buildings follow this sort of swish shape, with a low point occurring somewhere in between levels 50 and 70 for each one. Zooming in on this even further, we can see that the blue galaxy boosting buildings producing at least 15 forge points has a faster return on investment compared to the Cape Canaveral, which is frequently touted as having the fastest. This means that it would take about 174 days to level the blue galaxy to level 55, which is its fastest break-even point. The Kraken is the worst, with over 500 days to break even at level 55. This chart shows those lowest break-even times in a simpler way, and here's the list of the exact levels for each great building so that you don't have to just guess the level from the chart. It's important to remember that this is just one measure of a great building's power though. For example, even though the Kraken takes 500 days to break even under its own forge point production, it's still extremely useful to fight further at high attrition or in the 5th level of the guild expeditions, making it worth that investment. It's merely just a way to compare so many different great buildings. Moving on from all of the forge point stuff, we finally made it through, we get to some of my favorite comparisons, and actually what got me started working on this video. Which great buildings give the most trade coins and gemstones? Or even, how can a great building give any of the antique dealer resources? Well, there's 4 great buildings in this category: the Temple of Relics, Flying Island, Himeji Castle, and Space Carrier. The most obvious is the Temple of Relics, as it supplies relics that can give you buildings or items that we can then trade to the antique dealer. The Flying Island likewise gives us shards that can contain items that we can then trade away, and the Himeji Castle and Space Carrier each give their spoils of war or diplomatic gifts, respectively. As we can see, the Temple of Relics dominates in this category, giving us up to 5,000 trade coins per day at level 100 if you complete all 5 levels. The Flying Island only averages up to 2,000 trade coins, and the Himeji Castle and Space Carrier are completely negligible. The odds to win their selection kits are just so low that you don't get enough to make a difference at all. In terms of antique dealer gemstones, it looks like the exact same chart, but with different numbers. The Temple of Relics still dominates here, giving up to about 4 gems per day. The Flying Island drops to only 1 per day, and the Himeji Castle and Space Carrier can't even break 1/10 of a gem per day. Our last chart today can lend a bit of context to the Space Carrier's utility, and pay attention, diamond farmers. There are very few great buildings that can give either wishing wells or fountains of youth. In fact, there's only 2. The Space Carrier can give you wishing wells, and more importantly, their shrink kits as part of its diplomatic gifts selection kit, and the Temple of Relics can give us fountains of youth as part of its jade relic. The Temple of Relics can yield up to a whopping 43 fountains of youth on average every year, compared to the 3.25 fountains that you'll get from the guild expeditions every year. The Space Carrier isn't as good, but it can still muster up to 18 wishing wells or wishing well shrink kits at level 100, making it a surprisingly compelling pick to place in a diamond farm. I've also included one more line on this chart, which is how many wishing wells you can get in the Mogul settlement. You're able to loop the quests, get 5 wishing well fragments, and then abort the settlement in about 5 days, so you can get up to 24 wishing wells per year via this simple method. Combined together, you can actually still generate a crazy number of wishing wells or fountains of youth per year, but I think we'll have to leave the discussion of diamond farming to a separate video. Those are all the comparisons that I've got for this video though. Please let me know which great building surprised you, and consider joining my Discord server to discuss these ones or see my videos in progress, linked down below. That's all for today, and as always, I'll see you next time.